June 3, 1989, the death of 86-year-old Ayatollah Khomeini recorded the creation of a state where the gallows became the primary argument of power. His passing did not stall the machine. It revealed a finished, autonomous engine of repression. How did the system survive its creator? It learned to kill faster than it could judge. The noise in Tehran was deafening. 10 million people choked the streets for the funeral of the supreme leader. A sea of black fabric and rhythmic chanting, but this roar masked a decade of absolute silence. While the crowds mourned, thousands of families searched for ghosts. No public trials, no warnings, no marked graves. In the summer of 1988 alone, secret committees emptied prison cells in weeks. They buried the evidence in the dust of Kavaran. The regime's true legacy was not the revolution. It was the logistics of the end. The first shots rang out in February 1979 on the roofs of Tehran. By the late 80s, the chaos of the firing squad had evolved into the cold efficiency of the rope. The system targeted everyone: former officials, student activists, alleged spies, drug offenders. Each execution was a brick in the foundation of the new republic. By 1989, the state no longer needed a leader to command the terror. The bureaucracy of death was self-sustaining. It stripped the condemned of their last chance to speak before the noose tightened. By the time Ayatollah Khomeini was buried in 1989, this mechanism of death had ceased to be chaotic. It was now a standardized industry of slaughter. 3 distinct tools. 3 specific psychological targets. 1979. The early days of the revolution. Firing squads operated on the rooftops of Tehran. The cracks of rifles signaled revolutionary justice to the elites. It was raw, it was loud. It was a message to the old guard that the past was being erased by lead. Early 1980s. The terror moved to the streets. Construction cranes became gallows in public squares. Why cranes? They were visible from blocks away. They turned the urban skyline into a theater of fear for the masses. The state didn't just kill, it staged a performance of its reach. 1988. The machine moved behind thick walls. Mass hangings inside prison halls. No witnesses, no noise, just organized, cold efficiency. The chaos of the streets had been replaced by a bureaucratic conveyor belt. Was it a political dissident or a common drug runner? For the system, the charge was secondary. The machinery of capital punishment remained the foundation of the country's entire legal order. While construction cranes loomed over public squares in the early 1980s, the revolutionary courts launched a parallel engine of death. The pretext was a holy war against Afghan narcotics. How does a regime legalize hundreds of state-sanctioned killings in the eyes of the public? It declares a radical, uncompromising war on drug trafficking. The geography of the trade was the first catalyst. Following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, opium and heroin production across the border exploded. Iran sat directly on the primary vein to Europe. Smuggling networks carved deep roots through Sistan and Baluchistan province. Large quantities of narcotics flowed across the eastern frontier. Tehran saw more than a crime. They saw a moral contagion. Under the direct authority of Ruhollah Khomeini, the state tightened the noose. New laws introduced in the early 1980s made death the standard price for possession. The threshold for a capital sentence was low. A few grams of heroin or morphine meant the gallows. Repeat offenders faced the same end. The legal mechanics were stripped of all friction. The revolutionary courts took control. A suspect was arrested, interrogated, dragged before a judge. There were no defense lawyers to slow the gears, no meaningful appeals to stop the clock. The trials lasted minutes. The execution followed almost immediately. In the prisons, the process was a silent assembly line. In the streets, it was a spectacle. The heavy steel arm of a construction crane would swing over a crowded square. The cable tightened. A rhythmic metallic screech echoed as the machinery lifted the condemned into the air. The government called it social protection. The world called it a massacre. By the mid-1980s, the body count reached hundreds every year. Human rights monitors began documenting an anomaly in global statistics. Iran had climbed to one of the highest execution rates per capita on the planet. The most terrifying numbers did not emerge from public trials. They took shape in absolute secrecy during the summer of 1988, when the state turned its blade against those already behind bars. How did thousands of prisoners vanish without a trace? Their names were simply struck from the ledgers and moved to unmarked trenches. The logistics followed a cold, industrial rhythm. Guards led prisoners toward a separate section of the facility. Most did not understand the destination. Inside prison halls and storage rooms, the air was dead. No cameras, no crowds, no slogans. Only the heavy silence of the corridors. The death commissions worked with surgical speed. A prisoner entered. A few questions about loyalty to the MEK were asked. A signature followed. Guards brought them in batches. Ropes were already dangling from the ceiling, prepared in advance. One group out, the next group in. The state was killing people faster than the Jacobins during the French Revolution. In July and August, the focus was the MEK. By September, the purge expanded. The two-day party and other Marxist groups were next. Systematic, bureaucratic, final. The cruelty continued after the pulse stopped. Families received no phone calls, no official statements. Months later, some were summoned to prison offices. An official handed over a plastic bag with a watch or a ring. They were told to take the belongings and leave. Public mourning was strictly forbidden. No ceremonies, no gravestones. Most bodies ended up in mass graves, like the Kavaran Cemetery on the outskirts of Tehran. Bulldozers later disturbed the earth to erase the evidence. This was not the chaos of revolution. It was the machinery of a settled regime. Between July and September, the state liquidated between 4,000 and 5,000 political opponents. In July 1988, secret commissions began operating behind the walls of Evin and Gohardasht prisons. They surpassed everything that came before in both scale and silence. The Iran-Iraq War was over. Tehran had accepted United Nations Resolution 598. The slaughter at the front stopped, but inside the cells, a new one was just beginning. How did the system shift to industrial executions without a single trial? The answer lay in secret directives. Grand Ayatollah Khomeini issued a classified order. The target, political prisoners already serving their sentences. Most belonged to the MEK or the two-day party. Days earlier, the MEK had launched a desperate cross-border raid from Iraq. The Iranian military crushed Operation Forub Javadan in 72 hours. In Tehran, the defeat triggered a thirst for total liquidation. The state formed special panels. Survivors later named them the Death Commissions. In Tehran, the board consisted of Sharia judge Hossein Ali Nayeri, prosecutor Morteza Eshraghi, and intelligence ministry representative Mostafa Pourmohammadi. The process was a bureaucratic conveyor belt. A guard led the prisoner into a small room. The judges sat behind a desk littered with files. The only sound was the dry rustle of paper as the judge turned a page. The interrogation lasted 3 minutes. One question: do you still support the MEK? If the prisoner hesitated or refused to repent, Nayeri signed the form. A single stroke of the pen. No appeal, no defense. Over the next few months, these commissions killed between 4,000 and 5,000 people. The regime was liquidating its enemies faster than the Jacobins during the French Revolution. Guards led the condemned out of the room. They were told they were being transferred to a different wing. Most prisoners went quietly, unaware they were walking toward the gallows. The industrial scale of the 1988 secret purges was built on a foundation of blood laid years earlier. By the end of 1981, the Iranian state had perfected the mechanics of death. The sequence was a closed loop: arrest, short interrogation, brief trial, execution. The entire process from accusation to the gallows took only a few days. At the center of this machine was the construction crane. The Revolutionary Guard transformed industrial tools into instruments of public terror. A crane would crawl into a city square. The setup was simple, the message was absolute. Crowds gathered after radio announcements. The condemned stood bound, surrounded by guards. A thick rope looped around the neck, hooked to the crane's steel arm. The operator pulled the lever. The mechanical clang of the crane echoed across the square. The body rose slowly. Death was not instantaneous. It lasted several minutes as the victim struggled in mid-air. Medical teams stood by only to confirm the heart had stopped. The state made no attempt to hide the agony. By the mid-1980s, Iran reached one of the highest execution rates on the planet relative to its population. International human rights groups documented a total lack of legal defense. They reported on the rapid-fire trials that lasted minutes. But the regime remained indifferent to global pressure. The spectacle was the point. State television cameras captured the swaying bodies for the evening news. These recordings were broadcast nationwide to show the Republic's decisive hand. Public execution became a staple of the evening program. The cycle of televised deaths required a trigger, a reason to strip away the last mask of legality. That reason arrived in the summer of 1981. June 20th. Tehran erupted. Thousands took to the streets after the regime stripped President Abolhassan Banisadr of his power. The People's Mujahideen, or MEK, led the charge. The state declared them enemies of God. The tension snapped 8 days later, June 28. A massive explosion ripped through the headquarters of the Islamic Republican Party. 70 officials died instantly. Among the charred rubble lay the body of Mohammad Beheshti. He was the Chief Justice, the architect of the new legal system. What forced the regime to discard its final illusions of justice? The June 28 blast. His death gave the state a blank check for slaughter. The crackdown was total. Operatives flooded Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz. They hunted students. They arrested writers and anyone caught holding a pamphlet. Most were barely 20 years old. The trials were a dark parody. No lawyers, no appeals. A judge asked one question: "Are you with the MEK?" A yes was a death warrant. A maybe was the same. The scale of the purge was staggering. More than 2,000 people were executed in 1981 alone. Inside Evin prison, the air turned thick. It smelled of damp stone and the sweat of blindfolded teenagers. Guards moved with mechanical efficiency. They led prisoners down narrow corridors in groups. Hands were bound tight behind backs. They didn't hang them one by one anymore. To save time, guards lined them up and kicked the stools out in clusters. The temporary bloodletting of the revolution was merely a blueprint. These chaotic courts would eventually evolve into the secret death commissions of 1988. The legal foundation for the coming decade of terror was cemented in December 1979. That month, the new constitution was approved. Ruhollah Khomeini officially became the supreme leader. The revolutionary courts were no longer tools of street justice. They were a permanent branch of the state. These tribunals operated in Tehran and every major city with cold, bureaucratic precision. In September 1980, the external world collided with the internal purge. Iraq invaded Iran. The war became a shield. As in many dictatorships, the regime used the foreign threat to justify a total cleansing of domestic enemies. Military pressure from the outside meant zero tolerance for dissent on the inside. Why waste time on trials when the nation is at war? The mechanics of death shifted. Firing squads were still used for high-ranking officers and intelligence figures. But bullets were expensive and required trained marksmen. The state needed something more industrial. To simplify the process, the system transitioned from firing squads to hangings as the primary method of mass execution. Permanent fear took root before the judicial system even finished its blueprints. In the spring of 1979, the streets of Tehran, Qom, and Tabriz transformed. Construction cranes appeared in public squares. The state did not use them for building, they used them for theater. The ritual followed a mechanical rhythm. Guards led the condemned man to the center of the crowd. His hands were bound tight behind his back. Why use construction equipment? To ensure the agony lasted several minutes in front of 1,000 eyes. The executioner looped a thick rope around the neck. He hooked the other end to the heavy steel crane. The operator engaged the engine. The mechanical roar of the motor drowned out the whispers of the crowd. The crane arm pivoted upward. The body rose slowly. There was no sudden drop, no instant snap of the neck. The industrial winch pulled the victim into the air inch by inch. Death came by slow strangulation. The lungs fought for air while the machine hummed with indifference. Sadegh Khalkhali oversaw the transformation. History remembers him as the hanging judge. Under his authority through the summer of 1979, the speed of the gallows matched the pace of his sentences. He did not seek justice, he sought a monopoly on life and death. Construction cranes, purchased for modernization, became the new permanent landmarks of the revolution. They stood as steel skeletons against the skyline. Guards left the bodies suspended in the air for several hours as a warning. The industrial gallows were just the visible edge. Behind them, the new regime built a judicial conveyor belt that moved faster than the cranes. Mass executions in the spring of 1979 became possible only because of one man, Sadegh Khalkhali. Khomeini appointed him directly, a Sharia judge with absolute power. Khalkhali did not seek justice. He sought the total liquidation of the old world. By February and March, the targets shifted from generals to the entire civil apparatus, ministers, police chiefs, and mid-level bureaucrats. How long does it take to end the life? In Khalkhali's court, less than 30 minutes. No defense lawyers, no appeals. The judge read the charges, asked 2 questions, and signed the paper. The primary weapon was a single phrase: corruption on earth. It is an ancient Quranic term. Khalkhali transformed it into a universal license to kill without evidence. To hold a high office under the Shah was to wage war against God. Under this logic, the sentence was automatic. By April 1979, firing squads had executed more than 100 high-ranking officials. The conveyor of death did not wait for spring. It began on February 15, 1979. The setting was the Rifa School in Tehran. By day, a place for primary education. By night, the roof became a state-sanctioned killing floor. 4 men stood against the cold brick: General Mehdi Rahimi, the military governor of the capital; General Nematollah Nasiri, the former head of the feared Savak intelligence service. Beside them, Generals Reza Naji and Manusher Khosrodad. Their trials had ended only hours earlier. Was there any chance for a defense? No attorneys were present. No jury weighed the evidence. No right to appeal existed. The proceedings were a formality for a predetermined end. The charge was corruption on earth, a sentence that carried only one penalty. The executioners moved with industrial speed. The generals were lined up. Blindfolds were tightened. Armed guards stepped forward, rifles leveled at close range. Then the volley. Muzzle flashes cut through the dark. The state did not hide the carnage. Photographers moved in immediately. Their flashes captured the shattered bodies slumped against the school's masonry. These images were not for archives. The new leadership wanted the public to see the blood. The footage of the bullet-torn remains played on state television. The television screens showed the dead. But the path to the firing squad began with an illusion of justice. Millions expected a new era. They got a decade of state-led slaughter. The contrast was absolute. Public hope for the law met the reality of the crane and the rooftop execution. These first night shots echoed just 2 weeks after the turning point. On February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini stepped onto Iranian soil. He had spent nearly 15 years in exile. The ground beneath him was already shaking. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had fled the country on January 16. His regime was a hollow shell. Ministers resigned in waves. Army units stood frozen in confusion. Protesters owned the streets. The collapse was industrial in its speed. Within 10 days of Khomeini's return, the monarchy was finished. On February 11, 1979, revolutionary forces seized the levers of power. They took the military bases. They occupied the radio stations. They moved into the government buildings of Tehran. The Islamic Republic did not officially exist yet, but the clerics already held the guns. Shadow structures replaced the old legal code. Revolutionary committees formed overnight. They created courts that ignored every rule of evidence. Their only metric was speed. Their only tool was punishment. The 2,500-year-old Persian monarchy disintegrated in exactly 10 days.